It was 1964 when the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC, first took up arms against the Colombian government. Over the next half-century, more than 220,000 people were killed and 5 million displaced. 50,000 more simply disappeared. For a time, the country was known as the kidnap capital, thanks in large part to FARC's abductions to help finance its forces. But all that may have come to an end last month when Colombia's president, Juan Manuel Santos, and FARC leader Rodrigo Londono signed a ceasefire agreement. Later, we'll talk with a leading Colombian politician, but we begin in Bogotá with CCTV's Toby Muse. And Toby, that ceasefire was negotiated between the Colombian government and FARC leaders over the past 3 years in Cuba. What can you tell us about that agreement?
Well, the ceasefire is certainly seen here in Colombia as a milestone within that agreement. The process, Colombians began feeling quite skeptical about this peace process. Remember, there had been various attempts to negotiate with the FARC since its founding in the 1960s, but no agreement has ever got as far as a ceasefire. And I think the feeling within Colombia now is this peace process is irreversible. Of course, the ceasefire is part of a larger agreement. That agreement includes demining. Colombia has one of the highest numbers of landmines in the world. There's also a commitment by the government to invest in the countryside. So, as the FARC say, the countryside isn't as abandoned as it was historically. There's also an agreement to eradicate coca, the raw material used to make cocaine. Now the speculation is, when will this deal be signed? We think it might be signed on July 20th, which would be apt because that's Colombia's Independence Day. And there's a symbolism there that I think the Colombian government and the FARC like. It's the birth of a new Colombia, a Colombia in peace.
And Toby, what needs to happen next to finally bring peace to Colombia?
Well, once the deal between the two sides is signed, then the FARC guerrillas will congregate in around 24 safe zones dotted around the country. Once the FARC guerrillas are there, then will begin what is possibly the most important part of this peace process, the disarmament. There's a very clear timetable of 180 days. The FARC has to demobilize and disarm all of its troops. At that point, the government will then put the vote to the Colombian people, will give the Colombian people the chance to vote on the peace accord. They'll take it to a plebiscite. Latest polls show that most Colombians are in favor of this peace deal. But there's an irony of this I would point out. As President Juan Manuel Santos receives praise from across the world for his handling of this peace deal, at home he's actually very, very unpopular. One poll in May gave him just a rating of 20%. So it's going to be interesting to see how the president's popularity will figure in the campaign for the peace process.
Thanks, Toby. That's CCTV's Toby Muse reporting from Bogotá. Joining us here in Washington is Professor Eric Langer. He focuses on Latin America at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Also with us is Juan Carlos Hidalgo. He's a Latin America policy analyst at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. And joining us from Medellin via Skype is Paloma Valencia. She's a Colombian senator with the Democratic Center Party. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Senator, let me start with you. There have been many attempts at peace in Colombia. Up to now, all have failed. Do you believe that this ceasefire deal and possible peace agreement will hold this time?
I don't think so. I think that you shouldn't treat in equal terms peace with an agreement with one of the terror organizations that have action over the Colombian territory. In 1991, actually, we had a new constitution, and they promised us peace in that precise word, saying that the negotiation with other guerrillas will end all the killings in Colombia. And actually what happens after the new constitution, it was the 90s, it was a horrible hell for Colombians. Everybody was kidnapped, everybody was killed. Because what happens in Colombia is that we have illegal drug trafficking and illegal mining that gives a lot of money to any criminal organization, and what we're doing is that trying to negotiate with one, and they're reborning with a new name with the same money and the same capacity of killing Colombians.
What do you make of that, Eric? The senator doesn't seem very optimistic there that this is a deal that'll hold, saying that there are some parties, I presume she's referring to the ELN, which is another guerrilla group, which is not party to this agreement, that's not signed on?
Well, I think the real problem is what's going to happen after the peace process finishes. And I think the senator has a point, namely that the real difficulty isn't going to be signing a peace process or the peace accords, which I think is basically in the bag at this point, but rather what's going to happen afterwards and whether the state can actually expand its power, its influence, have, in Weberian terms, a monopoly of over the violence in the rest of the country. And I think that's really the biggest challenge for the Colombian government, because that's when the hard work really starts. We have other places where you've had a peace process which has been successful, but which still maintains lots of violence and problems. El Salvador, Guatemala, where you have really high rates of homicide and crime. And the question is, how do you get people who have been fighting all their lives and basically learned how to kill people, do something else afterwards? And that takes a lot of resources, and it also means that the state really has to be able to, if you will, embrace them and bring them into the system, which is what the peace accords are supposed to do, but you need enough resources for that. And the question is if there are enough resources for that. So in fact, that is a problem. But on the other hand, the peace process, I think, is a really good first step, but it's really on the first step in a much longer process.
Juan Carlos, that does raise the question of, as Eric points out, how do you get people who've been engaged in a war for most of their lives do something else? The reason for this war initially was because of economic inequality, land reform. Have those issues been addressed?
Well, part of the agreement has to deal with that, land redistribution, trying to give opportunities to people, to these soldiers that have been engaging in a war for over 40 years. But right now, Colombia is a thriving economy. It has a decent growth rate, 4%. It has enormous disparities, for sure, and those need to be addressed through education, through bringing the state, as Professor Langer says, to those regions where the state has been absent all these years. My concern is, picking what the senator said, is that as long as drug trafficking remains illegal, namely coca cultivation and cocaine production, there's going to be a very profitable industry there that is going to remain in hands of criminals. So far, yes, the FARC began as a peasant movement, but it morphed into a terrorist, criminal, drug trafficking organization, and is being in charge of Colombia's cocaine production for many years. And the estimates vary how much money they make yearly on cocaine production. Some people say $500 million a year. Some put the figure at 1.5 billion.
Are you saying that a criminal element in Colombia can then undermine this entire peace agreement?
I can say that they can morph again. I mean, the FARC as an entity can cease to exist, but that doesn't mean that the people behind this business are going to just go away. They're probably going to keep some arms, and they're going to rearm again, and they're going to keep threatening the peace of the Colombian people.
So, Senator, what are the obligations that this ceasefire agreement and possible peace deal place on the two sides right now?
Well, I don't like this peace agreement at all. First of all, because it didn't give jail to criminals that committed crimes against humanity, and that is a very bad example for Colombia. If you want to build a peace, you will really need to be focusing on giving the good example to society. In this ceasefire that they agree, it has very complicated issues. First of all, the government has made an alliance with a terror organization as FARC to make a combat against all other terror organizations in the territory. I think that it's very dangerous because you're losing as a state your legitimacy to have the monopoly of the gangs, the monopoly of the violence, as someone mentioned earlier. So this agreement remembers a very sad part of Colombian history in which one government make a deal with some other drug dealers cartels to kill Pablo Escobar. And it was a very horrible thing to say, but it did happen. So I'm really worried that that's the way this agreement is going, because what you should do to give peace to Colombia is to build strong institutions, just institutions, to have a very strong presence all over the territory. But it seems that we're weakening the law, we're weakening the institutions, and we're hurting the legitimacy of the state. So I think it's a very dangerous agreement for the Colombian people.
Right. Eric, the Senator has some valid points there, but the question is, what's the alternative?
Well, I think that's the issue. The party that the senator represents is, if you will, says everything has to be pure and has to be good, and the state really has to be as strong as possible, and there has to be essentially, if not a military victory, something close to that. And I can understand that. The problem is that politics is sausage making. It's ugly. And to a certain extent, I think it's really difficult to see how the Colombian state could ever get to that point without making some kind of deals. And obviously, politics is presumably the art of the possible, and I think this is what's possible right now. That doesn't mean that the government shouldn't, and security forces shouldn't continue pressuring first of all, the ELN, but also the former members of the FARC once that happens, and continue to expand the state presence. But I think what's really important here is to make sure that the state continues to fortify. And I think when you do that, then there's a chance for this in the next 10 years to basically a peace truly take hold. And that's why, in that sense, I'm in agreement with the senator that this is not an easy process. It's not going to be pretty. There are going to be lots of people who are not going to be on it. They're going to keep their arms. They're going to become criminal gangs, et cetera, et cetera. But as you say, what's the alternative? And for me, this is actually a really good first step. The hard part, like I say, isn't right now. It's what comes afterwards.
It is a first step. And, you know, Juan Carlos, the leader of FARC, Rodrigo Londono, he put it this way. He said, look, this is not a surrender by FARC, but there is a recognition that on both sides, that neither side was able to win militarily.
That's a key point. And let's remember where this peace process began. It began with the FARC being extremely weakened after over a decade of being pounded by the military. Let's go back to the beginning of the century. The beginning of the century, Colombia was about to be taken over by the FARC. Right. Literally, the FARC surrounded the biggest cities, Medellin, Cali, Bogota. And the discussion here in Washington was at what point the FARC were going to run into Bogota and take over the government. Probably that's an exaggeration, but that's how many Colombians actually felt back then. It was because of the security policies of President Álvaro Uribe that we saw the FARC taking major hits in the amount of territory they control, and seeing some of their leaders being killed or captured. So when President Santos, who was Álvaro Uribe's Minister of Defense, came to power, many people expected that he will continue the policies of President Uribe of attacking the FARC relentlessly. And actually, he continued that. He actually killed Commander Cano, who was the leader of the FARC in the first months of his presidency. But then he gave this U-turn about talking about a peace process. Now, the way that the FARC now want to present this peace process is actually, well, this is equals. We reach an accord, you know, because we're at the same position. Was there a military option? Was it possible to defeat the FARC militarily? Probably, we don't know, probably at a high cost. Adam Isaacson, one of our colleagues here in Washington, from the Washington Office for Latin America, he says that we reach a point of bloody stalemate. You know, certainly the gains that the Colombian government could make against the FARC could have been made, but at a high cost. So it made sense to negotiate a peace deal. The question is whether the concessions that the Colombian government gave to the FARC justify that reality.